My name is Rhiannon Howe, and my capstone revolves around autism spectrum group homes and investigation of pandemic effects on independence. Before I get started, I'd like to introduce my committee members, Dr. Moore and Nate Rossi. Thank you so much for being here today. Mary Golden, as you all know, is the program chair of RIT's Interior Design Program. Nate Rossi is the principal architect at Rossi Architects, specializing in healthcare design, and Dr. Moore is a renowned industrial designer and president of Moore Design Associates. Here's my outline. I'll be discussing my thesis question, scope, significance, existing literature, interviews and tours, programming, design process, outcomes, next steps, and my conclusion. My thesis question is, how has COVID-19 impacted progress towards independence in autism spectrum disorder rehabilitation group homes? And the scope of my project is this. This undergraduate capstone thesis aims to explore how interior design can improve the group home environment for level 2 autistic adults who are in pursuit of independence during a global pandemic. This research will be impactful to the field of interior design and design as a whole, and could offer insight into how the needs of those on the spectrum are addressed in the future. It's extremely relevant at this point in time with the COVID-19 pandemic sending the whole globe reeling. Public health is a priority more than ever, and we need to consider our vulnerable populations, such as those on the autism spectrum. There are many lifestyle changes that they have had to adapt to lately with this pandemic, including quarantine, social distancing. All of this is made more difficult due to autistic individuals' difficulty with change. This project is impactful because the field of interior design in particular, this can offer insight to the needs of those on the spectrum that can be addressed in the future in other projects. Level 2 autism is defined by the DSM-5 as requiring substantial support. It includes symptoms such as deficits in verbal and nonverbal communication, apparent social impairments, even with supports in place, limited initiation of social interactions, and reduced or abnormal responses to social overtures from others. For example, a person that experiences inflexibility of behavior, difficulty coping with change, restricted or repetitive behaviors, and distress and or difficulty changing focus or action. This chart is a loose representation of the impact of COVID-19 on different populations. It's not exact due to conflicting evidence, but essentially those with mental disabilities are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 than neurotypical peers. Of course, the elderly are at a much higher risk, but when those categories overlap, the virus is more lethal than ever. Here's an overview of the existing literature. I began with group homes, which are defined as accommodation for between 4 and 6 people, where extensive or pervasive paid staff support is provided to the residents, both in the home and when leaving it to use community-based settings. Essentially, this is long-term, full-time care, and goals include civil rights, independence, choice, and inclusion. This led me to design a prototypical group home because these environments focus heavily on independence. I also looked into care facility typologies. These vary based on the intensity of care that is required. And because of this, there are many different of these care typologies. Group homes promote the most independence, so that is the direction that I went with this project due to the controlled environment and the constant care. As for caregiving and behavioral modification strategies, it is always important to refresh, remind, and refocus. And all of the programming is based on the needs of the client themselves, so their behavioral modification strategies will vary person to person. This can be supported through schedule use and routine, setting clear patterns, expectations, and wayfinding. I also looked into metrics for independence. There is a bit of a gap in research here. There are over 25 tests measuring the severity of ASD, but very few of those focus on independence, and none of them are used as a as more than a diagnostic tool in most cases. So for the most part, they're not accounting for improvement. They're just trying to diagnose with these. And as for case studies, there are very few studies done on independence or design in group homes, which led me to perform my own based on interviews and tours that you will see shortly, performed for the purposes of this capstone project. Here are my interviews and tours. I began with a questionnaire that was a multi-point questionnaire aimed towards both staff members and residents. I was unable to distribute this due to COVID-19, so I shifted gears to conduct interviews instead. These interviews referenced the original questionnaire, but I only interviewed staff members due to the inability to get to speak to clients face-to-face, aside from shortly during tours. These addressed gaps, such as behavioral modification, the link between the built environment and independence, group homes and independence, and COVID-19 and independence. After these interviews, tours were conducted and recorded for archival purposes that documented the current conditions of existing group homes and allowed me to collect images to be used in my case study, where I compared and contrasted these images to kind of try to reach some conclusions regarding existing spaces. Unfortunately, the images are of lower quality due to the collection methods. The Zoom recordings did not make for great thick pictures, but I was unable to visit the spaces in person due to COVID. Interview 1 was with Ms. Precious Brown from Empowering People's Independence. When asked what behavioral modification strategies best help clients achieve independence, she told me that needs, wants, and plans are forever changing for her clients. So it was important for them to learn together about the pandemic and how to respond to it. Practicing patterns, especially new patterns like hand washing, mask wearing, and communication with others, which is hindered due to difficulty understanding which staff member residents are speaking to, and difficulty trying to understand emotion without those facial expressions and cues. So it's definitely been a learning experience for them, she told me. When asked what attributes of the built environment help or impede independence, she told me that her residents have been very excited about the opportunities to experience the community in other ways, using products like Grubhub to try new restaurants and new foods, which they haven't been able to do before, as well as their large dining room and living room becoming even more helpful than ever. The larger dining room allowed them to have 6-foot tables spaced for social distancing, and allowed them to still have family meals together despite the pandemic. And the large dining room or living room allowed them to give each resident their own seat that could be moved and practice social distancing while being part of group activities. When asked how does the group home setting help clients achieve independence, she told me that they have had more issues being restricted in the community. However, they have had the opportunity to refresh a lot of social skills at home, being so one-on-one with each other. And when asked how has COVID-19 impacted your client's ability to pursue independence in the group home, she told me that they've, in some ways, like Grubhub, had a little bit more independence in the community, but in most ways, her clients lost a lot of their independence when it came to leaving the home itself. They have, however, had the opportunity to learn and practice just sitting at home and relaxing with others, which is something that they haven't been able to work on very much in the past. And many of her residents actually joined advocacy groups together for those with disabilities during COVID, so they're joining Zoom calls and advocating for themselves there as well. Here are some images from that first tour. On the top left, you can see the dining room that I mentioned with the 6-foot tables. On the top right, you can see their kitchen. The residents did express to me that they did not love their kitchen. They said it was way too small. On the bottom left, you can see one of the residents' bedrooms, and on the bottom right, you can see the living room. Each resident there has their own armchair that can be moved around as needed. Interview 2 took place in the Mary Carriola Center with Mary Ellen Bills. When asked what behavioral modification strategies best help clients achieve independence, she told me that positive reinforcement and repetition was very important to clients, as was structured routine. They try to support this with use of daily schedules posted with unpreferred activities and events following demand. When asked what attributes of the built environment help or impede independence, she told me that it was very important to have a very organized space, so clients do not get sensory overload from their surroundings, and that they have a more clear understanding of where everything is in the home, which can help lower distress. They also implement cue cards around the group home itself with pictures, objects, or symbols from around the house that helps them to express their wants and needs more clearly. When asked, how does the group home setting help clients achieve independence? She told me that, again, each of their clients have individual plans they have to follow, so it's very important that one staff member is the one that cues the individuals so they're not confused with different messages. And these staff need to be trained to promote independence so that they have a consistent approach to teaching these skills. She also mentioned that it was very beneficial for the clients to have single bedrooms to allow them a little bit more of independence in that aspect by having their own space. And when asked how has COVID-19 impacted your client's ability to pursue independence in the group home, she told me that the changes in staffing patterns brought about by schedule changes have been very difficult on the clients, as they do experience difficulty with any changes, really. But this has also given them, this has also taken away their ability to practice skills in the community, unfortunately. Before, they would practice these social skills and take their clients out to a store, per se, and practice those skills there, but now they don't really have that opportunity. And here are some images from the second tour. On the top left, you can see their dining room. You can see it's set up pretty similarly to the first home. But they weren't practicing social distancing as strongly here, so I wasn't able to see the impact of that quite as much. On the bottom left, you can see the exterior of the Mary Carriola Center housing facility. And the two photos on the right are taken from a boy's bedroom that lived there. I found it very striking, the differences between the bedrooms that I was shown. The one on the left belongs to an adult woman and the one on the right belongs to a young boy. So there could have been some difference based on means or access to new furniture and decorations. However, it's very clear that there's a stark difference between the spaces in terms of personalization. The room on the right, the only real opportunity to display personal items was in the resident's closet behind closed doors. The rest of the room itself was very bare, aside from the SpongeBob blanket and a TV on the wall. Next, we'll move into my programming. As part of my research for the creative agenda, I looked at code, FGI guidelines, state regulations, and more to devise a comparative chart of features and amenities and functional requirements for my prototypical design. So here are some of the highlights from that. My key learnings from existing literature and personal research began with clear use of space. It's important to support wayfinding, use patterns, and clearly distinguish between public and private spaces. Next was clearance considerations. It was vital to accommodate for extra clearance throughout the space, beginning with the original ADA clearance adding room for aids to function, and then adding social distancing on top of that, a lot of the clearances became a lot larger than typical. As for personalization, the space should be easily personalized and appear as mainstream or as home-like as possible. And as for resident ownership, they should be encouraged to engage in chores, and they should support resident choice as much as possible to help give them the sense of ownership over their space and help promote independence that way. Some strategies that I got from this included those with COVID-19, such as social distancing, flexible spaces, and movable barriers. For involvement, there was personalization, reminders, task accessibility, and ownership. For accessibility itself, there were ADA components, ASD considerations, and extra clearance for aids. Public versus private space, there were zone considerations, visual and acoustic privacy, as well as labeling the rooms. And then for security, a high fence, keypad entry, and privacy were the considerations that I tried to target there. As for the design process, I began with an adjacency diagram, which helped allow me to group my spaces based on acoustic and adjacency needs, which led me to my bubble diagram, which helped me begin to visualize this and build the distinction between public and private spacage, which was then outlined here with the different colored rings. I then began to diagram. I began with fairly simple sketch diagrams and moved into block diagrams. This is the first iteration of the project. And now for the fun part, the outcomes. So this is the current floor plan. I put zones on it so you can see the distinction between public and private space has withstood all of this. So the front of the house is more private and the back of the house is, sorry, other way around. Front of the public and the back of the house is a more private setting. So I tried to group the public spaces around the front door so that people feel welcome entering the space, but I tried to create some visual barriers to prevent access to the back of the house. Here is the view of the entryway. You can see I made a little mudroom for including a large coat closet, a bench to sit down and take shoes off, some small storage. And to the right of the door, there is a keypad to allow entrance and exiting the home with a personalized key code. That's what they did at the Mary Cariola Center, and it allowed them to make sure they knew who was entering and exiting the building at all times. All of the residents had their own key codes. Here I have the activity room. The focus here was really accessibility. You can see I implemented clerestory windows throughout all of the hallways to bring in as much natural light as possible, just because the space is so large and it was important to bring natural light throughout. I did my best to reduce any blind corners by using a piece of opaque glass instead of a more solid barrier to the left there. And then to the right, I cut out part of the wall and put in windows so that to reduce the blind corners essentially and risk of people running into each other. I also tried to keep hallways as short as possible. They all kind of end at this little atrium area. This was trying to reduce the institutional feel and make the space more comfortable for residents. Here I have the toilet room plan. It was designed with ADA in mind, with a roll-in shower, and it has extra clearance for aides to be able to help residents at all times. Here I have the kitchen plan. This was designed to be a more collaborative space. After visiting with Miss Precious Brown at Empowering People's Independence, it was clear to me that the kitchen was kind of a communal zone there, and they were frustrated that all of the residents couldn't interact in the kitchen at the same time and enjoy their space together. So I implemented a larger breakfast bar that's ADA accessible. Those chairs can be taken away and it can be roll under space, as well as a large kitchen that could support multiple people cooking at the same time. Here I have the dining room plans. I designed this room with the intention of it being as COVID friendly as possible by implementing the strategy of using those multiple 6-foot tables that in the image to the left, and then in the image to the right, I've shown that you can push them back together and have a more traditional banquet style meal in that room as well. As for the bedroom plans, the key points here were really accessibility, keeping the space private, and promoting involvement by making them as personalizable as possible. So I have shown an ADA friendly bedroom to the top left, and I've shown 2 other possible layouts at the bottom. The idea was that the space could be arranged in multiple ways so that residents can bring in their own furniture should they choose, so they can set up their room how they like. And the idea is that personalization of the space would be encouraged through paint and decorations and such, just like at Empowering People's Independence. Here I have a view of that ADA bedroom. You can see I've tried to show a little bit of the personalization. Residents would be able to hang personal items, move the furniture around as much as they want. There is a curtain, like a pull down curtain in the window. It's just a little bit hard to see. And I also added a TV to show that they could be personalized in that way. And I implemented dimmer switches throughout the bedrooms so that residents have control over the amount of light within their rooms. As for the laundry floor plan, part of the most important factor here when designing this was involvement, just trying to support residents being independent in their spaces by being able to perform these household tasks and learning how to do them independently. So the idea was, excuse me, to make an accessible space. The little closet on the left there is a lockable cleaning supply storage. The bar at the top left is a fold down folding station for folding laundry and such. It also would be roll under. There is a hand washing sink and a washer dryer that are both front load and raised up on a small plinth for easier accessibility of the space. There would also be cue cards within this space providing a list of tasks that need to be performed in order to successfully do laundry. I put 2 quiet rooms in the space. They were inspired by the Snoslin rooms, which are sensory spaces that use a lot of LED lights and positive distractions to help clients decompress when they've had a bit of sensory overload. So both of the rooms have color changing LED strips around the ceiling. They each include a different positive distraction. The one in the top left has a fish tank, and the one in the bottom right has a bubble wall, or like a bubble tube along the wall. I also included different options for seating, all of this to promote resident choice of how they want to self-soothe and decompress. So there is a hanging compression chair in the top left, along with a bean bag, and then a more active Herman Miller spun chair in the second quiet room. Here's a view of the living room. The main concern here was COVID-19. All of the furniture that I chose is modular, so these sofas are not set. All of the furniture can be taken apart and moved around as much as possible at will. The idea being that everything would be on casters. to support multiple configurations of the space and making sure that residents have multiple ways to use the furniture and relax within their space. Here is the plan of the living room. I used all of these plants, the idea being that they are as well on casters to provide a soft barrier. You can see that they are partially blocking off the room at the top because it is an open space. However, they could be moved around and the space could be entirely blocked, or they could be used as room dividers. The idea was flexibility. And here is the final floor plan. My next steps, should I continue, were to implement that multi-point questionnaire that I had created originally. Being able to take my time with distribution and wade through some of the red tape and paperwork to do so would be valuable, I think, to get that client input. And the second point of the next steps would be to continue the interviews and tours to build a larger case study and collect a lot more reference images to create a more holistic view of existing spaces. In conclusion, I chose this topic because I have a younger sibling on the autism spectrum. Not only do I find design for mental illness fascinating, I understand the incredible impact it can have on a life. This research question is a far larger problem than I expected when beginning my capstone, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to work with my wonderful committee to make a meaningful contribution to the design field. So thank you. Any questions?
So I guess that goes to me next. How are you? It's a pleasure to meet you. Very lovely, fascinating presentation and case study. So I'm very interested in it. I guess one of my first questions to you would be, I'm wondering a little bit more about the effects of the pandemic experience to the interior and how that has impacted the interior environment. I have definitely seen the response to the needs of the community. You've absolutely done a great job sort of addressing those concerns and what you've learned from all your case studies and the homes that the women at the homes that you've spoken to. But I'm wondering, aside from social distancing, what other considerations were taken into, what else did you take into consideration, I guess, considering pandemic world within that interior environment? I hope that question made sense. I feel like it's a big one.
No, I think I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I'd say the other big focus, aside from social distancing for COVID in particular, was especially the flexibility of space, just because so many of the activities that would have taken place outside of the home, such as class, therapy, medical evaluations, things like that, are now taking place within the home itself. So it's important to have these flexible spaces and options for the residents on where to go within the home and how to block off these spaces and make them as usable as possible for anything that might come up.
So I think that was what you were trying to say about that big living room area, was that level of flexibility within that furniture.
That is the activity room.
Yeah. Okay. So as moving forward, you know, what I'm thinking about that space in particular is right now it's all lounge pieces,
Right.
and again, just trying to tie in a little bit of that pandemic idea, you know, which was sort of a, you know, an underlying, which was a point of your thesis, which is demonstrating because right now it's flexible in terms of seating and seating choice, which is great. But if it you just touched on a few things, classroom and things like that, I think the room may want to sort of reflect a little bit more of that multi-use ability, as opposed to just sort of that lounge furniture. So I think that you want the environment to sort of reflect all of that opportunity that space had in particular.
Right, absolutely.
a second question I have, having read your manuscript, in your manuscript, you talked a little bit about PPE and the need for PPE. How did that get expressed? How did you sort of resolve the need for that, and possibly in a discretionary sort of way within the space?
I had difficulty coming up with a way to really design for PPE. I kind of struggled with the link there. I guess the biggest change that I made was trying to make the spaces usable for um, social distancing, as well
Hmm.
as like allowing a lot of clear sight lines so that people can see each other from a distance, of course. But I definitely did struggle in terms of bringing in that trouble with PPE and facial expressions and communication into the design itself.
That's fair. That's fair. Um, So I'm looking at my notes. I'm going to ask an odd question, but you referenced the bubble tube.
Yes.
I have no idea what that is. Um, I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on what that is and the benefits of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So a bubble tube is essentially, for the most, usually you might see them in, for example, like a children's science museum. They're like those cylindrical tubes that are filled with bubbles and they change colors. They're just nice to look at. So the idea was to implement a positive distraction into the space. So instead of focusing on all of these other sensory issues or being stressed out or just kind of amped up and needing to relax, the idea is to give the resident something like calming and kind of mesmerizing to watch instead.
Hmm. Thank you. I was just being curious on that one. Additionally, when I'm sort of harping on the COVID, the pandemic sort of aspect of it, and I apologize for that, but I do think you did a very thorough job of sort of addressing a lot of the concerns for the resident, within for those who have autism, and I think you've addressed a lot of that. Um, I am seeing sort of some opportunity to maybe deeper dive a little bit into the pandemic sort of influence on some of the changes. I think a question I would have would be, if this were just to sort of stimulate the thinking, is how would you do this? Would you do anything differently really in a non-pandemic world? Or was all of that sort of room and space to grow sort of indicative of what the building typology really needs? And is any of that really, I'm just asking the question. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if I were to do it again and COVID was not a factor, the space would be a lot smaller. I did make it large because I wanted it to be as comfortable and inclusive as possible to resident needs. Um, but if they're not in the space as often, I also did reading that indicated that it's helpful for the home to look as residential as possible from the outside. And right now it's a very large space.
Okay. So I'm also wondering, so you talked a lot about the opportunity to personalize the patient room. Excuse me, I do healthcare, so the residence room. um, is there an opportunity or a benefit to having some flexibility to personalize maybe some of the outside space? Yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. There is benefit there as well. I tried to leave that a little bit more open ended because that would be something that the residents would come together to decide themselves. In the group homes that I visited, they had pictures of the residents on the walls, art that they'd made. So it would be little touches like that throughout that are just a little bit difficult to show in a prototype.
Absolutely. You may want to think about creating some dedicated space in the public area, for that opportunity to, whether it's right outside everyone's individual door, or something that sort of addresses that, because it is a large part of what you were talking about that personal room. And then how does that then start to connect into those public spaces? And as the designer, you may want to, what's the word I want to use? Control is not the word I want to use. You want to sort of sort of structure that opportunity within the space, so that there are places for it, and then because there should be rationale around why it's okay to personalize this area, and maybe why we wouldn't want to do it maybe closer to that front of the door, and maybe that is something closer towards the back. So starting to think through some of that extension of, if this is a residence home, how do those two areas bleed? At the moment, there is a hard line, sort of, this is your space, this is sort of everything else. And so how does that sort of blend itself a little bit? And I think that would be, that would also be, I think that would be a nice flow into sort of connecting those two ideas. Right now, they do sort of feel a little separate from each other, but I do think there's an opportunity to bring those together at some point in the public areas of the space. And I think that would be interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Great suggestion.
One of the other things that I want to ask you about was, did you give was there any, you had a staff area, I saw that. Staff being to patient care, to anyone's care, they're just such a critical aspect of it. Talk to me a little bit more about what your thoughts are about the staff area. They are, so important to the success of the space itself.
Right, absolutely. I did originally have a slide about the staff space, but I took it out because I thought it was going to be too long. So I apologize.
Fair. No. It was in your manuscript. You touched on it in there, so I had already made notes. I think that's fair.
Let's see. I had in the staff space, you can enter either through kind of a little general entrance area where there are lockers and a message board for staff to kind of show up and enter the space in like the work mindset. I gave them their own restroom in there so that they're not trying to use the resident toilet rooms. There is also one in the public space, but trying to give as much as this, give all of the ownership of even the public spaces to the residents by giving the staff their own personal spaces that are not resident accessible. So they have their own break room with a kitchenette. They have an office. They have all of the, they have like the little locker room area as well as a changing area. They even have like a designated bedroom for any overnight stays that may need to happen. Essentially, they were kind of given their own private space to find reprieve and work without without impeding on into the resident space. I think she froze.
Colleen, can you hear us? Oh. Well, let's give her a moment to repopulate. Oh, there she goes. Did we lose her completely?
I think so.
Okay, so while we wait for Colleen to sign back in, why don't we jump to Patty and Nate? Patty, it looks like you have your mic off. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Excellent. Absolutely excellent. Considering our starting point and all the challenges you had, I'm so very happy for you. This has been a very difficult assignment, and I think you definitely are off to a grand start. And as we've talked before, should you decide that this is a career path for you, that you can make significant contributions, both from your role as a sibling with great empathy and then the other side of the coin as a designer. You said something that surprised me before, and I even double checked it. Autism is not a mental illness. And so you want to be really careful about assigning it that value, because that's I think part of the public's fear and misunderstanding. And so you are a voice for clarification and reassurance and promoting health and wellness and quality of life. So be very careful about that. And I would have loved to have seen more about the exterior, as we've talked about in some of our review calls, and having those special areas, hideaways and gardens, where each resident might resonate and gravitate to spaces on the exterior, particularly in the backyard, the more private area. So yeah, I'd had a slide about that.
That was another slide that I did have, but I ended up losing because I thought it was too long. It will definitely pop up in the manuscript tonight. Good. I'm gonna populate those images, and then you'll have the full picture. Okay,
good, yeah. Because I think you had said things to me earlier when we were in group meetings before that I was impressed with. And then we talked about staff, but I want to revisit the recognition of the presence or the absence because of COVID of family. And so how going forward have we as designers been informed about the flexibility of the spaces we create, the environments we make, so that people that are so important to us, our primary family members, are able to be part and parcel of our daily lives. And I know that's a huge challenge for my primary role in geriatric care. How do we make sure that we can include families because they were excluded so extensively throughout the pandemic and are just now representing themselves. And clinically, we've seen great damage done to dementia patients. Lost days, weeks, and months that they will not recover because of the lack of socialization. So you want to, I think, keep an eye on that going forward as well. Two itty bitty things, because I am known for this. You said that your glass partitions were better than solid walls because they were opaque. You meant translucent.
I meant translucent.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm the persnickety judge. Blame the Sisters of Mercy. I do. And also when you're referencing things such as the ADA, be careful of that language. You used in one citation, you called it inspired. Your design was inspired by it. And in another, you said it was ADA friendly. And what you're talking about is compliance. You're either compliant or you're not if you're citing ADA stipulations, okay? So that's really not too much gray area there. Yeah, I'm just very excited to see what you decide to do next.
Thank you. Me too.
I do apologize that I lost internet connection and I dropped off. I'm so sorry. I hope I didn't throw everything off. I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Do you mind if I finish sort of my one last thought when I got cut off about staff experience and things like that? Do you mind? Am I cutting into everyone's time?
No, you're okay. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just going to suggest as you continue forward and you start thinking about incorporating the staff, if it is such a large component to your design, I would look into the Watson theory. Jean Watson wrote a whole article about compassion fatigue. She wrote this whole sort of manifesto sort of about treating staff within the space and giving them an opportunity for respite so that they are under such stress. And I think that just, sort of folds into benefiting the patient or the resident experience as well. You talked a lot in your manuscript about agitation and sort of this, what the staff is dealing with. And so I think that's a lovely sort of component to the bigger picture of the entire environment, particularly in a pandemic when they're dealing with extraordinary circumstances, along with the resident experience. Just a little thing that you might want to. It would be just a nice little add, as you continue on.
Sure,
sorry, I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
Nate?
also, I'd echo Patty. Congratulations, you've come very far. The structure, especially the manuscript and your presentation, have developed immensely. The presentation of the problem and the structure of all the supporting documentation flowed clearly and was well organized. So kudos for that.
Thank you.
One thing that has always kind of struck me that I think you did very well in your manuscript is making a case for independence being a crucial measure. You went into the fact that independence isn't necessarily something that is clinically measured or one of the metrics upon which that you could quantify, but how important that is. You spoke about that quite a bit in your presentation and in your design. A lot of that seemed to focus on a couple areas, one being the ability to personalize for decor. And I would echo what Colleen said about dedicating space for that, especially in a resident home for ASD where you can have some issues with visual overload or sensory, to be able to, again, I don't want to say control either, but to make sure that that doesn't get out of hand to a point where it becomes problematic, because it is a balance that you need to manage. And then I guess, you also talked about some of the things, both from your research and from your interviews, about wayfinding patterns and providing cues in the environment to help residents. Do you want to talk a little bit more about how you implemented that?
Sure. I did have a little bit of difficulty implementing wayfinding into the space just because it's not quite that big. I did try to put in that central atrium area that the view of the activity room was taken from, just to kind of give like a central area that all the hallways return to, so that there is a clear path at all times, as well as labeling the resident bedrooms and things like that.
Okay, great. Nitpicky critical things, just because that's what we're all graphic people. I thought that your PowerPoint had the title bar on the left-hand side, which took a lot of your graphics and pushed them into a square, even though they were more of a horizontal aspect, which shrunk them even further.
Okay.
Just something to consider for other presentations, to try to maybe format your title bar to support your graphics.
Okay.
And some of your graphics, especially the floor plan enlargement, I thought could have benefited from a little bit of color and a pop. Again, we're all graphic people, and one of the things that we do is we bring that to the table. I guess it's a skill that we have to draw your eye towards that and to clearly explain complex situations and concepts to people using graphics to simplify them.
Okay.
I'm going to also add with what Nate was just saying, we're storytellers in
Right.
order to really bring the client along. And when that perspective of that central atrium that you had provided, I lost the context. Something very easy could have been, I think, maybe an axon of the whole space, with that sort of highlighted. So really understanding the relationships of things, to understand where exactly, I understood the point you were trying to make, and I loved the incorporation of the glass. I really wanted to understand it in the broader context of the storytelling of why that was important. Like that moment was impactful, but why from the rest of the building, was that an important decision to make? And so just thinking through, it's not just always about the perspective, but what's the story? And sometimes you tell a little bit more to get down to what you're trying to achieve. So just again, thinking, I think Nate made a great point, thinking about your graphics and how they support your narrative, because winning over a client, it's like 80% narrative. If you can sell them on the idea, the rest of it sort of comes into play. The design itself gets won over if your story is strong and then it's represented well.
Right. Absolutely.
And they don't all have to be graphics or images that you've created, right? I mean, those quiet rooms, you talked about them being inspired by something else. You talked about the bubble wall, pulling an image of a bubble wall to add to that slide.
Okay.
It can help
Yeah,
be supportive.
It doesn't have to be something you designed necessarily, but it needs to be sort of illustrative to what you're trying to achieve so that
Okay.
everyone comes along on your journey with you and understands, even just little images of those womb chairs and those wonderful, you talk about this comfort that you get in those spaces, but it was this black and white picture. So some elements of comfort and cozy that would give a sense of calm on that slide would also tell a really strong story, I think, moving forward. The ideas are all there for sure, and the intent, it's just, demonstrating them in a presentation format.
Okay,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I think that was it. I mean, you went in verbally and talked about small little touches that I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about, and just having that graphically depicted, I think would have helped support you a bit more.
Okay, thank you.
So again, this was a very important topic. When I first heard your thesis topic, I thought, oh my gosh, how is she going to do this? This is an emerging situation. It's going to be difficult with patient information. There's a lot of challenges in your way, and you've worked really hard to come at them from different angles to persevere despite all those roadblocks. So again, kudos, and it's very important to, I think, continue this research on.
I thought it was very interesting that there's no research on gaining independence. And so I agree with what Nate's saying. I think it's very interesting to carry that on to see that the impact that an interior environment and that supportive environment could have to this population type gaining independence, which is important. So I also think it's wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for your comments. Congratulations, Rhiannon. I really appreciate your presentation today. So I'd like to extend a sincere thank you on behalf of RIT's Interior Design Program to Colleen and to our committee members, Patty and Nate, for their valuable feedback. We're indebted to all of you for your thoughtful cross-examination of Rhiannon's work. So I would also like to thank Kat Basney for helping behind the scenes here on our call today. And also thank our audience who's been growing in numbers over the course of Rhiannon's presentation for your attention and support. So the committee and the examining scholar and I will now enter in a break room for deliberations, and this completes our final oral defense for Rhiannon Howe. And for those of you on the call, you are welcome to stay on the main page here for the next presentation while we jump into the breakout room. So thank you all and have a great day.